as we take our seats, so this is a very interesting incident that I managed and negotiated and found a resolution for. And to give you a bit of a background about me, because many of you might not know much about me, I actually started out very young, younger than Bia here. I was actually in computers starting from around the age of 5, and unfortunately at the age of 10, I was busted for breaking into the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So after I was 18 and I was allowed to use a computer again, the U.S. Air Force so kindly recruited me and started using my specific talents for them in various ways. I also was a military aviator and worked for Space Command. In my previous role, I headed digital security for IT, IoT, and ICS systems for the Saudi Aramco family across EMEA and Latin America. So, where I was located for the Aramco family, my office was in The Hague, the Netherlands. And one day I was eating lunch, which was pretty rare because I did a lot of things for Aramco, including heading the Joint International Intelligence Team, the Security Operations Center, and the Network Operations Center, so I almost never got a chance to eat lunch. But this day, it was a special day, and I was chowing down into some spinach salad, and I was having a great time until a very large man in a very nice tailored suit stepped up to me and he says, "Ms. Quebeca, there's a problem." And I go, "Uh-oh, what kind of problem is this?" And he goes, "Come with me." So I had been summoned by this gentleman who took me into our MD's office and said, "We need to get you to the Saudi Arabian embassy immediately. They've been hacked." Saudi Arabian embassy wasn't too far away from my office, so I'm like, okay, let me see what I can do. Let me take my forensics person with me. And when we got there, it was very interesting because it started out with an email hack and grew all the way to the point where a terrorist group tried to extort the city. It was so bad that the Embassy of Saudi Arabia and several other embassies in The Hague actually put a disclaimer on their website to warn them that there was something going on in The Hague with their embassies. And it also included the Dutch National Terrorism Police, and it spread to every embassy with a business email on the back end. So one of the reasons why I was chosen was because I'd already been doing a whole bunch for the Saudi Aramco family, and it was myself and my team that actually reconnected business operations in 2013 after they were the victim of the world's worst cyber warfare attack when the Iranians hit them with a piece of malware called Shamoon. And that piece of malware was a wiper piece of malware, and it knocked out 85% of their Windows-based computer systems. It also took out 2 oil production facilities at the time, and it basically stopped their business operations completely. They were back to typewriters. They could not load petrol trucks or fuel trucks, as you might call them here. The country of Saudi Arabia was running out of gasoline, so if you went up to the pump, you could not get any. If you called an ambulance, the ambulance had no fuel. So I was a trusted individual with the Saudi Arabian government and the Saudi Aramco family. I also have law enforcement experience, not just getting busted by law enforcement, mind you, but also dealing with various cyber crimes and being the interface in those particular investigations. And I'm very good at communicating, so I regularly talk to heads of state and ministers and so forth. Later this month, I'll be doing 2 workshops with the United Nations, one on IoT and one on protecting journalists with Reporters Without Borders. Now, during this time frame, we have a right-wing individual in the Netherlands called Geert Wilders, and he had made a video at the time where it looked like he was ripping up the Quran. And this angered a lot of the rest of the world. So they also insisted, after I brought my forensics person, who was Dutch, that he had to leave. But I could stay because I'm a US citizen. The Saudi Arabian government also canceled over €1 billion worth of contracts of Dutch companies and kicked a lot of Dutch citizens out of Saudi Arabia during this time frame. So it ended up only myself handled the case after I arrived. Now, there's another thing to remember with an embassy. An embassy is a piece of a country, and that means that local law enforcement does not apply, local laws do not apply. The police are non-existent. Now, in the diplomatic world, there is something called the diplomatic corps, but they cannot, say, openly arrest somebody without causing an international incident if they have a diplomatic passport. I really miss the days I traveled on my diplomatic passport. It made things a lot easier. And another thing to consider is the fact that the ambassador is the leader of that embassy and is, in essence, the king or queen of that embassy for that country. So what we found initially, because we were allowed to do a packet capture on the network with the forensics guy before he was kicked out, was we found a commercial off-the-shelf piece of malware. Now, what's interesting about this was we were able to trace the transaction of the purchase of the malware when I solved the case to someone who was affiliated with the Iranian government. Now, the way that cyber espionage works is a nation state can spend millions on some fancy schmancy APT, or if they want plausible deniability, then they will use commercial off the shelf so that it doesn't look like they immediately did it. And this happened to be the case. Unfortunately, this also involved an insider working, or thought he was working completely for ISIS. Now, at the same time, we also had another type of an incident. And I like to say, you never forget the first time you were droned. This was my office in blue, and in the red was the embassy of Yemen. Now, Yemen, all of a sudden, they decided to purchase the building next to my office, the Aramco headquarters of Europe. And what's unusual is it was not in the embassy section at all. It was a very expensive building. They were cash poor at the time, supposedly the government. But they bought it for cash, straight up cash. And shortly after they moved in, we started having some problems with the embassy, our good old neighbors. We caught them in our backyard of our property, digging in to try to get to our fiber optic cable to bend and surveil. We caught several of their employees pretending to be our employees inside our building in the cafeteria because we did not have a proper wall for the outdoor eating area, which we built shortly afterwards. And then one day I was talking to my boss, and we happened to be on the top floor of the building, and I looked behind him, facing outside in the windows, and there is a very nice commercial grade drone. Well, it turns out the Yemeni embassy decided that they were going to try to surveil us by using drones and flying 1 to 3 drones around our building. Now, because local laws don't apply, we couldn't just call the police, but we had to have the diplomatic corps step in, and also the Dutch government explain they could fly the drone over their own property, but it was illegal to fly it over anyone else's property. And they also had to register the drones as well if they were to do so, because we actually have very strict drone laws in the Netherlands, so you can't just do that. So finally they stopped. But there were a few other incidents involving the Yemeni embassy as well, and some of my direct personnel. So when I got there, there was a young man. He had just started that week. He was a bit nervous, obviously, because here's this big incident. And he's saying, well, what can I do? What can I help you with? I go, well, listen, what happened? He goes, well, there were some suspicious emails. And I think that the email account has been hacked. And I go, okay, all right, so let's get to the bottom of this. What is the password for the email account for your embassy? 123456, right? How many people think that that's a great password for an embassy, right? Great password for no one. And what had piqued their suspicions was there was only one person allowed to handle the embassy emails, and that was the ambassador's secretary. And it was also the only computer that was supposed to be set up for this system. And when Saudi Arabian National had asked the embassy, hey, can you help me out with procuring a visa, and this person did not know that the Saudi Arabian embassy stopped doing visas, they were sent back an email saying, hey, I can expedite that visa for you if you just give me some money. And so this was the email. And what it said was, sure, man, we can get that visa for you if you send me $200 right over to MoneyGram in the name of the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the United Kingdom, who happens to be a prince. So this kind of looks suspicious, right? So from this point, it involved several email events going back and forth where the perpetrator had been able to get into the email account, doing a man in the middle, sending messages back and forth. And it was very unfortunate because it started to get a bit personal during this time frame, and the perpetrator attempted to also make believe that the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the UK was actually having an affair with the person who had sent in the visa request. And the person who sent it in, she's a rather controversial figure. She used to run a lot of Islamic schools in the United Kingdom that were funded by the Saudi Arabian government, and they were shut down by the UK government because of extremist literature that they were giving to children. So they were trying to start a scandal in a place where there had not been a scandal. So we locked down the email account. Because I'm not a Saudi Arabian citizen, I can only do so much, and made a whole bunch of recommendations. And then 2 weeks later, I'm eating lunch. I'm finally eating lunch again. And then here comes the same guy, very large man in a very nice suit, and says, Ms. Quebeca, we have an issue. Can you please come with me? And I was like, all right, we've already done the embassy thing. He doesn't act like a family member died. Hopefully they didn't find out I was mining Bitcoin on the supercomputers. But instead, it turns out that the perpetrator still had access somehow to that email account. And instead of it being $200 for a visa, suddenly it went up to $25,000 signed ISIS. And this email was sent from the Saudi Arabian embassy's official back channel email account to the rest of the GCC countries in the Middle East and to Turkey, which included Oman, which, if you know much about current geopolitics, Saudi Arabia and Oman are not friends. Qatar and Saudi Arabia are not friends. So, second email comes, it says, hey, I'm a friend. You can save many lives by just sending me $25,000, signed ISIS. I sanitized a little bit of it, but it was from Saudi Embassy, signed ISIS. So it's always nice to know who you're working with, right? So you know exactly what you might be dealing with. Now, unfortunately, the diplomatic corps were trying to be proactive. However, they had no permission whatsoever to send out any emails regarding this incident. And this was supposed to be involving only the Saudi Arabian embassy, and we were using diplomatic means with the other embassies, including I was already collecting evidence from those other embassies who were giving it to me freely, except for Turkey, they did not. And now we all know that they're also not friends. And the diplomatic corps decided to send a warning email out to every single embassy in The Hague on their official back office channel to say, hey, if you get any of these suspicious emails trying to extort you for money, go ahead and send it to us and we'll see if we can help you out. Well, that sounds really cool, except they used CC instead of BCC, and the perpetrator was still on the back end. So now, instead, they responded back, and also to every single embassy in The Hague that was included on that CC. Then they started taunting the diplomatic corps and saying, I'm so glad we have your attention now. The amount's going up. So then it started getting very, very personal. Now in this case, the perpetrator, while I was still trying to figure out things because I only had limited access, broke into the ambassador's secretary's personal Gmail account and then sent an extortion demand for $35 million. Now, of course, this freaked out the secretary, so she filed a local police report. Unfortunately, we had to ask that local police station to make it disappear. which they accommodated for us. Then it got even worse. Now, this happens to be a place called the Kurhaus, and it's a national landmark in the Netherlands. This is where all the rich and famous people would stay at before they headed out on their luxurious cruise ships before we had KLM Airlines in the Netherlands. And we were about to host something called Saudi National Day, which a lot of different countries, they will have a national day wherever they might be, and they invite, in our case, the Dutch royal family, the ambassador to the US, the ambassador to Romania, the ambassador to the UK, Japan, so on and so forth. So when I say VVVIPs, they were definitely VVVVVVIPs. And so the perpetrator changed tactics and said, if you don't give us $50 million, we are going to blow up the Kurhaus and everyone in it. So it was at this point that the Dutch National Terrorism Police came into view and tried to start helping us out, but because of the geopolitical nature of things that were going on, the ambassador wanted nothing to do with them. So privately, the embassy section of The Hague went on lockdown. We had plainclothes but armed forces around that entire area. Bodyguards were hired. Embassies were very, very rattled about this because their ambassadors and their staff were targeted in this case. And to make matters worse, I was finally able to take a piece of equipment home with me because I was at this point so well trusted, and I was doing all the liaison work between the ambassador himself and any law enforcement and all the rest of the embassies, that I was able to figure out that the perpetrator had set up a forwarder on the back end of the email account, and that's how they could see the traffic going back and forth, the email. And suddenly the ambassador himself said, I think I know who it is. So one evening, after everyone had left except for his close protection bodyguards, I was left behind with him in the building, and he started getting down on his hands and knees, helping me look for Post-it notes for credentials for the suspect, because we did not want the person to know that we were on to him, because that could have made matters much, much worse. And because of the suspect had diplomatic immunity. So, especially in this case, law enforcement did not apply whatsoever. I was able to then get the perpetrator out of the email account. Then the perpetrator started sending emails from other accounts in, also repeating the various threats, also listing specific ambassadors' names that they were going to kill, mentioning the Dutch royal family, and so forth. But the perpetrator screwed up, did not mask where he was coming from, so I was able to geolocate several of the emails to the exact neighborhood that he lived in The Hague. So that was between the personal nature of the attacks, the way he acted when I interviewed him on several occasions, and the geolocation information. The ambassador was very, very certain it was this particular individual. Now, in the mix, while we're dealing with all of this, around the corner from both the embassy and where I lived, because I lived in the embassy section of The Hague, I used to frequent this lovely pub called Sherlock's Pub, which is all Sherlock-themed. It's fantastic. It won the Best British Pub in the Netherlands award, because I didn't even know that that was a competition, right? So, you know, when you're stressed or when you'd like a beer, I could walk right over. It was a block from my house. And one evening I go in, and the owner is there, and he goes, these three guys have been waiting for you for 2 hours. Now, I'll give this disclaimer in case there's anybody from the Turkish government or associated with them, because I met one at Luxembourg last week who was not happy with this talk. I'm sorry their intelligence agents were so dumb. So they had been sitting there for almost 3 hours at a pub, sipping tea, waiting specifically for me. So I walk over and I go, hello, I heard that you were waiting for me. 3 people I had never met in my life. So they give me their cards. They happen to work for the Turkish embassy. All three of them are cultural attachés. And they have been waiting there so that I could give them English lessons. And they spoke perfect English, right? Does anyone think that this is suspicious, right? Not at all. So for 2.5 weeks, I dealt with these individuals, gave them English lessons. They would wait for me patiently at the pub, sipping tea until I could arrive. And I, of course, reported this to the security services, and they verified, indeed, yes, they were working for the Turkish embassy, that they were cultural attachés, that they also had diplomatic immunity. Great stuff, right? And then at the same time, I was also notified that they found a list, and on that list, it was a list from ISIS, and I was number 2 out of 10 people for a high-value target. So things started getting even more interesting because it wasn't just an incident involving the dumb, dumber, and dumbest intel agents I had ever run into in my life, but now I was at real physical risk. So I'm not a person who likes close protection bodyguards, so I made agreements for them to just watch me at all times. And towards the end of the 2.5-week time period that I was dealing with these Turkish intelligence agents, one of them gave me an unusual gift. I am not Muslim. I do wear an Arabic necklace, but I'm not Muslim. Gave me prayer beads, which of course I promptly handed over to security services to make sure that they didn't have a bug in them, right? So after the 2.5-week time period, they just disappeared. And when I asked security services, they verified that all three of them had left in a bit of a hurry out of the Netherlands, never to be seen again, right? So towards the end, because the incident lasted almost 3 months, and it was a stressful 3 months because most incidents do not last that long. I'm lucky I still have hair. And we did not pay any extortion. We ensured that all the embassies were safe. We did a lot of talking, myself and the ambassador, with various other countries using diplomatic means to basically apologize for what happened, to work with them. And also, I made a lot of recommendations for the Saudi Arabian embassy because the way it had been set up was very, very bad. They did not have antivirus. They had Windows Defender, right? And they had a business network, and like many embassies in the world, an intelligence network. Luckily, they were completely separated, because that would have been even worse, right? But they used a home-grade router, for example. That also had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? Their networking rack was in an area where all you had to do was, if you walked into the embassy, you didn't even have to register the way it was laid out. It was in a dark corner. There were no cameras. You could just tap right in, or like Jason would, pop, 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 right? So that had to be changed. But the matter with the person who was the suspect, now I do not condone extrajudicial punishment. However, he was from a very high-ranking family, very good family from Saudi Arabia, and the likelihood that he would have been prosecuted when he was sent back to Saudi Arabia was very, 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 very low. So he was promptly reassigned to a physically dangerous location, and shortly after he arrived, after his bodyguards got out of the car, he was the only person blown up in a car bomb. So I like to say modern problems require modern solutions. So I got some rewards because it was very stressful. And one of the things I got to do was, there's a very famous painting in the Netherlands. It's actually listed in an addendum of the Constitution which states that only a Dutch citizen can ever own this painting. It's by Rembrandt, and it's called The Night Watchman. And it's actually bigger than this screen. It's not like the Mona Lisa, tiny, tiny, right? No, no, no. So when the ambassador was leaving the Netherlands, he had a farewell dinner in front of the in the Rijksmuseum, in front of this famous painting, and gave me a gift and an award, which I also tested. I don't trust anything from a foreign government. That's the way I roll. And I got to enjoy the evening. Unfortunately, I was sick that night, so I couldn't partake of all the fancy schmancy wine, so I could just smell it. But that's okay. And I learned a lot of lessons that sometimes when you're involved in an incident that might be as simple as somebody leaving a password of 1234556, depending on the situation, that could be rather low risk, or it could get people killed or almost killed. So thinking about how certain things can actually cause real human consequences is very, very important. Now imagine if you were dealing with a nuclear event. Imagine if you were dealing with the aviation industry or the space industry or something of that nature. I have been, there was my 5th nuclear incident. I've got lots of stories like Jason. Actually involved a nuclear crane. Luckily, it was not carrying the rod when it collapsed. And the vendor had not told the nuclear facility that they had installed a 3G modem in it with a public IP address. Yeah, because that's a great idea. So you never know with these different types of things. Obviously, never trust gifts from a foreign agent or, you know, anyone kind of suspicious. And also prepare. So if you're ever involved in one of these types of incidents, one of the mistakes that I did not make was I had a partner at the time, and I thought, hey, he doesn't need to know about any of this. I don't want to scare him. But unfortunately, the person closest to you, or the people closest to you, can actually be used against you in these particular types of incidents, what we would call your next or closest hop. And another thing that I learned was try your best not to panic in these particular situations, and also pause before you speak as much as possible. There's 2 benefits to that. You think deeply about what you're going to say, especially when you're dealing with a minister or you're dealing with an ambassador of another country. And another thing is, you kind of look smarter when you do that long little pause, right? So try your best to just take a deep breath. And I did leave some time for questions, so we should have about 15 minutes to do questions. And I hear that if you ask a question, you can get a hat. And who doesn't like hats? So thank you very much, and I'm open for questions.
Chris, that was absolutely fantastic. My mind is blown. I have a lot of questions, but first we're going to take some from the audience. So if you have questions, raise your hand and let's get this party started. Yes, here, one in the front.
All right. Now I'm thirsty.
Okay, hi. First of all, great story. Just wanted to ask, let's say, did 10-year-old, I think, you, after hacking the DOJ, did it ever cross your mind in that 8-year-old period from being 10 to being 18 and being able to use a computer again, basically? Did you ever think you would actually be in charge of handling such a massive event, I guess?
Absolutely not. I was so happy just to use a computer again because I had made so many dumb mistakes as a 10-year-old me that I didn't think that I would be involved in something like that. I knew at the time, both when I was 10 and when I was 18, that I wanted to get into computer science. And I hated the fact that during that 8-year time period, I was not even allowed to use a gaming console. So I could only watch friends and cousins who would always point it out because they were little bastards. But I never thought that I would be involved in something like this.
And let's say, having known that that would have happened, how would it have swayed you away from doing stuff like this, or would that just empower you even more?
I would have been empowered even more, and I would have learned French a lot better to deal with diplomats, which is one of my challenges that I'm facing right now. I need to speak French more.
Okay.
I'm
Thanks.
horrible.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Next question, somewhere there in the middle. Yes, we see your enthusiasm. Right in front of you. No, keep your hands up. Yes. We'll get to everyone, I promise.
Hi, I just loved your presentation. I'm not really sure how you can go through all that and still be so funny and so humorous. So congrats on that. But you seem so confident. I have to ask the question, were you at all at any time afraid for your life? And my second question would be if you mentioned at some point that they might use your partner. Was your partner used against you in some way, and how?
So, because of my military background, I have to thank that very much for handling these particular situations. And I was trained for various things, like if I was kidnapped and held hostage and things of that nature. And at one time in my life, I actually was kidnapped and held hostage for a 2.5-week time period. So this was a lot simpler in many ways, because I wasn't, being, tied up and gagged. That sucked. But I also have the belief that I could be hit by a bus. I could be hit by a car. I could, not wake up tomorrow because, I don't know, I might have some undiagnosed medical issue. So not very much. Now, my partner was not targeted in this particular case, but because of this incident, on a later case, a more recent case, actually he was placed under surveillance by a foreign government, but he was prepared at the time.
Wow, thanks.
Okay, next question. Here in front. The mic is coming to you, and then we're going to go there in the middle.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. And I'm just doing this for the hat. No, just kidding. So you mentioned the 3 Turkish intelligence that you met in the bar and you taught them English and stuff. I'm curious, how was the interaction with them? Because you had to actually give lessons, right? And you had to do as if you didn't suspect anything, or how was that?
Well, I didn't have like a lesson plan, but we did conversational English. And they asked me a lot of very interesting questions about things, especially dealing with the Saudi Aramco infrastructure, which I danced around because these were very strange people. And they were trying to, I think, feel me out, also to distract me during this time period, which didn't work because, I knew everything that was going on. But it was just conversations, long conversations over tea at a pub, which was very strange. But kind of entertaining at the end. Now I can definitely laugh about it.
Thank you.
We had a question there in the middle. Yes, please keep your hand raised so we can get the mic to you. No?
Hello. How would be your life without a computer?
Very boring.
Okay, how did you fight with your demons while not being able to use a computer?
Well, I kind of turned it around. So at the time, I had to take typewriting lessons, of all things. So I can text like a teenager. So that's pretty cool. I tried to do other things, but still keeping track of what was going on in the burgeoning computer industry at the time. So the day after I turned 18, I bought a computer for myself.
Wow. Okay, thanks. That's it.
Okay, on to the next question.
There's the pink guy. He's been like raising his hand the whole time.
Hey, I was very curious about your digital fingerprinting and how do you, I don't know, how much you work on not having so much digital fingerprinting?
Well, over the last 7 years, I was more permitted and allowed to come out in the world at a previous job. So, although I don't have an actual Facebook account, I've got various fake ones and so forth. I just try to know my surroundings because I know that I am now a bit more of a public person than I was before. 7 years ago, there was only one picture ever of me on the internet, and that was a LinkedIn picture. So I just watch myself. I don't, if I think that I might be in a dangerous situation or I might suspect certain things, then I try to divert where I might be and try to use precautions including checking out the hotels that I stay at, speaking with their physical security staff as well. So I try to keep myself safe in that manner. And I have no IoT devices. And a commercial firewall at my house. I do have. Yes, yes. This is my hobby.
On to the next one.
There's a question there.
So congrats about the presentation. So I'm a nervous flyer, and I wanted to ask you about something I read. You uncovered some vulnerabilities in the Boeing network, so I wanted to ask about that. Can you tell us about it?
Yes, I can tell you a little bit about it. A couple of the things that I found on Boeing were quite disturbing. Nowadays, aircraft are flying computers. They're driven by software. They have autopilot. They also have sensors. And I was able to, because of egregious coding errors, able to bypass authentication to get into both the live and test aviation ID systems. And that system for Boeing is how you log in and you get flight control software for classified, unclassified planes and also satellite systems. And that was part of what I found. I also found a way using open source intelligence to find all of Boeing's fleet's in-cockpit cabin view monitoring system as well. So, and there's a few other things. And I've been getting a lot of pressure from Boeing, so I'll be nice and leave it at that. Yes.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. Yes?
Hi. Thank you for the presentation and nice to meet you. I'm a journalist, and you mentioned that you are going to work with Reporters Without Borders
Yes.
on a project to better protect journalists. Can you tell us more about that? And from your experience, have you seen journalists being targeted? Do you think it's increasing? How do you think journalists should, because it's not about only journalists, it's about their sources as well.
Exactly.
And how can journalists, if they don't know how to protect themselves, how can they teach their
themselves.
sources to protect themselves? Thank you.
Sure. So the workshop is for cybersecurity for journalists specifically to discuss protecting themselves and also their sources. Not every journalist works for The Guardian or the BBC or what have you and gets security awareness training. So a lot of journalists, especially independent journalists, are not so cybersecurity savvy. And when they get documents and data from a source, they can actually get, unfortunately, targeted, and then that source gets found out. We've just heard, if you've been listening to the United States news, that Donald Trump's son outed the CIA analyst who was the whistleblower, which is, as far as I'm aware, illegal, but I'm not a lawyer. It's imperative that we have freedom of the press. And I'm a big believer of that. So one of the things that I do on the side is I work with journalists and set up various trainings for them to try to keep them safe. Because I've been a source myself, and I would like to be kept safe in these particular circumstances. It's something that I do pro bono.
Cool. So one last question, if anyone has them, because we've, if
I
not,
see one way back there, all the way in the back
Yes.
row.
wait for the mic. Keep your hand up. We're getting there. Almost. Here we are.
Thank you. I enjoyed your speech.
Could you
and my
please
question.
stand up so we can see you? Okay,
Okay.
thanks.
Thank you. Sorry. I enjoyed your speech very, very much, and I actually like those kind of stories which imply diplomats and such things. But my question is, do you believe that at the moment of speaking, there are other diplomats or VVVIPs that still have such a weak security? And how people like you try to prevent issues like the one in your speech to happen again?
Yes, quite a few embassies from various countries do have very weak security. In many cases, the people hired at these embassies are not a computer expert, but somebody who is from a high-ranking family. There's nepotism and so forth, and favors that are given. Not every country does this, luckily, but some do. And absolutely, I was speaking with a minister from Luxembourg the week before last about this particular topic, which I agreed to help on a few things. And this is not the only type of incident that's happened within diplomatic circles. There are actually much, much worse incidents that have occurred from cybersecurity issues of weak security, which have actually cost lives.
Thank you so much, Chris. Once again, this was absolutely amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.